What's going on, guys? So today I'm going to show you how I created this amazing 75-gallon Vivarium in just 4 days. And it's just such a fun project. I've been waiting forever to do it, and now I'm finally going to show you guys how I did it. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is lay the tank on its back so you can figure out how you want your driftwood to be laid out. Now this is really important to do ahead of time because you don't want to film everything in and not like what you're looking at. So I had a couple pieces of driftwood here, one big one and two smaller ones, and I'm just kind of positioning them to see how I'm going to want to foam them in and kind of getting an idea of what it's going to look like ahead of time. After I did this, I took some regular pieces of styrofoam just to kind of use as filler so I don't have to use as much spray foam, and just kind of position them in the scape to give me some extra dimension and texture. Then I took my can of spray foam, and this instance I'm using Great Stuff foam. It's super cheap, like $3 a can, and I think we only went through about 2 to 3 cans. Now once you have your foam, it's time to spray it on. Now you can spray it on however you want. You can make it thick, you can make it thin, you can add some peaks, you can add some indentions. However you want to create the texture for the tank, it's up to you. You just want to make sure you cover the entire back of the tank and make sure you use it to secure that driftwood in place so that when you tilt it up, it doesn't fall out. As you can see, we used about 2.5 cans of spray foam, which is not bad considering they're only about $3 to $4 a can. You can really get a lot of coverage with each can. Like I said, just make sure you cover the entire background and just give it some dimensions. You don't want it all flat, but you don't want it too thick to take up too much room in your vivarium. So once we sprayed it on, a little trick that we use to kind of cure it a lot faster is you spray it with a little bit of water. Now this makes it harden a lot quicker and makes you be able to go right into carving it within the same day, which is what we were able to do, and it saves a ton of time. So the next step, once you've made sure that the foam is cured and dried completely through, is to carve it. Now the reason you carve it is to get rid of that smooth surface, and so you can have a rough texture for the silicone to adhere to, and it just holds on a lot better, and you don't have as many white spots once you go and knock off the excess dirt. So this is a really tedious process and it takes forever, but I promise you it's worth it, and it really does help with the overall appearance in the end and gives it a better look. So just take your time and make sure you carve as much of the surface as possible. Now the next step, once you've got your foam carved, is to apply the silicone. Now I'm using type 1 silicone in brown. I use the brown because it's easier to hide the white behind it if you miss a few spots. You really want to make sure you get full coverage. You don't want to skip out on the silicone because it's going to make for a lot more work later when you have to go back and reapply to cover white spots. So you really want to make sure you cover everything up. Now we started from the bottom of the aquarium so that we're not reaching over wet silicone as we go through. And we're just kind of each doing a section at a time, and then we're going to go with it and apply the cocoa fiber or peat moss to the silicone. You don't want to do all the silicone at once and then apply your peat moss or cocoa fiber, because then the silicone can dry and it just wouldn't adhere properly. So you want to do maybe like 1/4 of the tank, and then once you've applied your silicone to that 1/4 of the tank, go back and put your peat moss or cocoa fiber, then go on to the next section. That way the silicone doesn't have time to dry before you put on the peat moss or cocoa fiber. So we're each doing a different technique. Now Mitchell, who's in the red shirt, he is cutting open a tube of silicone and then taking it out with his fingers and just kind of spreading it around. This is a really good way to get good coverage, but use a little bit more silicone. But he got way better coverage than I did, and it was a little easier for him in a tank like this. Now I'm just using the traditional caulking gun, where I put my tube of silicone into the gun, kind of squeeze out a section, and then I go back with my left hand and smooth it over with my fingers. Either way, I think the easiest way to smooth it into the gaps is going to be using your fingers on a gloved hand. I've tried using a paintbrush and it just doesn't get the coverage that you need. When I use my hands, I can kind of make sure it gets in every crevice. Now once we've applied all of the peat moss and silicone and everything like that, we give it time to dry. You can kind of spray it down like you did, and that'll help it dry. Once it's completely dried, then you want to stand it up. When you stand it up, all the loose peat moss or cocoa fiber is going to fall down, but you're not done. You want to kind of vacuum off and make sure you get all of that loose cocoa fiber or peat moss. That way it's not falling off later on. You can kind of see where your white spots are. We got extremely lucky and we really didn't have any white spots. Once we got the tank all vacuumed out, it was time to add our drainage layer. For this tank, I chose to choose 1 bag of river rock to create a shallow drainage layer. If I have any excess water, I can just kind of siphon it out. Some people use a thicker drainage layer, but for this tank, I didn't want to add too much weight, so I just went with this bag of river rocks, and it's worked out so far. It's really been okay. I haven't had any standing water in the tank. Once we got our drainage layer all smoothed out, it's time to add our soil. Now for soil, I kind of have my own mixture. I use black cow composted manure, peat moss or cocoa fiber, orchid bark, and sphagnum moss. Now the ratio just kind of varies depending on the size of the tank, but typically it's about 2 parts black cow, 2 parts peat moss or cocoa fiber. In this case, I'm using peat moss because it's cheaper and I have a ton of it. Cocoa fiber works just as well, if not a little bit better, but peat moss works just fine and it's very cost effective, and that's what I'm adding right here. You can get a huge bale of it for like 15 bucks at Lowe's, and it'll last you forever. So once I've added the 2 parts of soil and 2 parts of peat moss, the next step is to add the orchid bark and the sphagnum moss, which is going to be about 1 part of each. So you just kind of look at it and kind of guess how much you want. The reason you add the orchid bark and the sphagnum moss is for moisture control. Now the orchid bark is going to allow good aeration of the soil and keep it from getting too waterlogged. On the opposite end, the sphagnum moss is going to allow that moisture to be held in and keep the soil with just the right moisture level, so your soil can keep the humidity up in your tank, and whatever you put in my case, is frogs are going to have the correct humidity level that they need. Now when you take the orchid moss or sphagnum moss, you want to make sure you break it up. You don't want to put it in 2 fine pieces, which you can see me taking it out of the bag here and kind of breaking it up. Now you can put it in a blender and kind of shred it up, which would work really well, but I'm really lazy and I'm just kind of breaking it up with my hand. In a tank this big, the bigger pieces are going to do just fine in this tank and take a little longer to break down. Now once I've got all of my ingredients in my soil, kind of made sure that I have enough of each, the next step is just to mix it up. And I'm just kind of sticking my hands in here and just moving everything around, trying to get everything mixed up. That way it's very evenly distributed throughout the soil, and just making sure it looks like what I want it to look like. I've done this plenty of times, so I kind of know what the soil is supposed to look like when it's mixed properly. You can see here I'm adding more orchid bark, and that's because I realized that I didn't have quite enough in the soil, and I knew I wanted some more. I know it's a little hard to tell, but once you have everything mixed in, it's going to kind of look like this. You'll be able to see all the chunks, and it's about this consistency and look and appearance. So now that we've got our soil made, it's time to add it to the tank. To do that, we just decided to take the entire tub and dump all of the dirt in. We started to put it in little by little and realized that kind of didn't work, so we just kind of poured it all in there. Once you get all of the dirt into the tank, you can kind of move it around and kind of get that look that you are trying to achieve, whether you want some dips, whether you want some high portions. It's up to you how you layer your soil. You really just don't want it uniform. It looks a lot better when you can add some perspective and depth to the tank. Typically, the best thing to do is to start higher in the back and come lower in the front, which is what we did. We also made the left side of the tank a little higher than the right side of the tank. You can see here we didn't have quite enough soil, so I just took a 5-gallon bucket, I made another batch and added it into the tank so that we can get those hills that we're looking for in the tank. Now that we have all the dirt in our tank and we've kind of shaped it the way we want, the next step is so much fun, and that is adding the plants. Now I use a wide variety of plants. All of these plants came from my local nursery or from Lowe's. Now I know there is some kind of controversy about using plants from like Lowe's and Home Depot, and you do have to be careful. I know when I've gone to Home Depot, they do kind of flag the plants that use pesticides, but it doesn't necessarily mean they haven't. I make sure to wash all of my plants and remove all of the soil. Do this at your own risk. I've never had any problems. I've done this for years, but I just want you guys to know that there is a chance that there could be something harmful on your plants that could leach into your soil and affect your frogs. So I've added these 2 plants, and I also added this little seed pod, which was full of springtails that came from my other tank, and that helped seed the tank with springtails. I'm also going to add some springtails later on. So I'm just kind of adding different plants, testing out where I want them. You'll see that a lot of stuff do not end up where I first put them. I just added this bromeliad up on the top, and that is really good. The frogs, depending on the species, can lay their eggs in the bromeliad. You want to use a wide variety of plants. Some that are going to be tall, some that are going to be short. You want to put the taller ones in the back and obviously the shorter ones in the front. That way if you put the tall ones in the front, they don't overgrow and cover your other ones. You also don't want to use one plant here and one plant there. You kind of want to put pieces of each plant spread out through the tank, because in the jungle or wherever you're trying to replicate, one plant isn't going to grow here and the other plant isn't going to grow there. They're going to kind of all mix in and grow together. So if you want to get that kind of realistic look, you kind of want to mix everything in. That way that it kind of grows in between each other and it just gets that jungle look. You can see this plant that I'm planting right here. I break off into 3 or 4 sections and just plant it throughout the entire tank. That way when it grows up, it looks like it kind of grew all over the tank and then just kind of took over. I also have multiple types of ferns that are different ferns, but they look similar, and I put those all across the tank to give that kind of jungle fern look, and just kind of gave it that appearance that everything has been growing there for a while. And then once this tank is grown in, everything's going to look fantastic, and it's going to kind of spread out over the tank very well. One really important aspect to having a jungle looking vivarium is adding moss. Now right here I'm adding pieces of Java moss all over the tank. Now Java moss is originally an aquatic plant, but it grows really well in the humid environments of a vivarium, and it can grow really well just about anywhere you put it as long as you keep it moist. Now I had a little bit left over in my fish tanks and I moved them over into my vivarium. They didn't grow too well because I had trouble keeping the moisture up at first, but it is growing, and I added a different type of moss later on that is growing really well. Now once you've added all your plants, you want to make sure that you mist everything and saturate the soil and give all the plants a lot of water. That is crucial to adding new plants to anything. And once I've had the tanks thoroughly saturated, I added my cleanup crew. And now if you haven't seen my video on culturing springtails, make sure you take a look at that. The cleanup crew is really important, especially in a tank this big. They break down any mold or fungus that are going to build up. They're going to break down all of the waste in the tank, and they're really going to add a small food source to your frogs. And especially if you ever have any froglets, they are great for froglets. And also I added dwarf white isopods later on that are good food source for frogs and for breaking down waste. So now you can see the tank here. This is just after I finished it. I kind of turned the misting system on. I had to add more misting nozzles later on, but you can kind of see the misting system in action. The tank looks fantastic, and once it's grown in, it's going to look even better, and I can't wait to show you guys that later on. So that was the tank a few weeks later. You can see some plants died, some plants survived, but it is looking great, and I can't wait to show you guys a few months from now what it looks like. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and I'll see you guys later.
Bye.